I spent 22 years building a foundation for a daughter who did not share my DNA. I paid for her college, her luxury apartment in downtown Chicago, and the black SUV she drove to her wedding yesterday. I know she drove it there because I pay the insurance, but I did not know about the wedding until I saw the photos on Instagram. The caption read, "Just for special people." I stared at the screen, picked up my phone, and logged into my bank account. If I am not special enough to attend, I am certainly not special enough to pay. I stood in the center of my living room with a heavy cardboard box in my arms. It was filled with vintage table runners and silk fabric samples that my daughter, Chloe, had stored at my house for months. It was a Tuesday morning, and I had cleared my schedule to drive over to her apartment in the city to drop them off. She had been stressing about the wedding details for weeks, or so she told me whenever she asked for another transfer of funds. I looked at the calendar on my wall. We still had 2 months until the date she had vaguely mentioned in passing. I walked out to my truck, the same heavy-duty pickup I used to build my construction empire from the ground up. I placed the box on the passenger seat and started the engine. I had no idea that the box was already useless. I arrived at her apartment building in the trendy downtown district. It was a building with a doorman and a marble lobby, the kind of place I could never afford when I was her age. I parked the truck and looked up at her balcony on the 4th floor. That was when I saw it. There was a white banner zip-tied to the railing. It was fluttering in the wind, but the red cursive letters were unmistakable. Just married. I blinked and stared at it again. My brain tried to reject the visual information. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe it was for a roommate. But Chloe lived alone. I paid $4,500 a month to ensure she lived alone. I pulled out my phone. My thumb hovered over her contact name, but a gut instinct made me stop. I opened Instagram instead. I did not have to scroll far. The first image on my feed was from her new husband's aunt. It was a carousel of 10 high-resolution photos. There was Chloe, wearing the designer lace gown I had paid for 3 weeks ago. There was Ryan, her boyfriend of 2 years, looking sharp in a tuxedo. They were standing under a floral archway at the Botanical Gardens. The location tag said, "Yesterday." I felt a cold numbness spread from my chest to my fingertips. I swiped to the next photo. It was a reception dinner at a steakhouse that charged $100 a plate. And then I saw the caption. It was short, cruel, and precise. It read, "A perfect intimate ceremony. Yesterday was just for special people." I sat in my truck, the engine still idling, and read those 5 words over and over again. Just for special people. The numbness began to recede, replaced by a clarity so sharp it felt like a physical blow. I looked closely at the background of the dinner photo. Seated at the head table, holding a glass of champagne, was Brenda, my ex-wife, the woman who had walked out on Chloe and me 18 years ago because she wanted to find herself in California. She had found herself, apparently, at the head table of a wedding I was not invited to. I put the truck in reverse. I did not go up to the apartment. I did not leave the box of fabric samples. I drove straight to the dumpsters behind my office warehouse and threw the box into the compactor. Then I walked into my office, locked the door, and sat down at my mahogany desk. I did not cry. Men in my line of work do not solve problems by crying. We solve them by auditing the books. I opened my laptop and pulled up the spreadsheet labeled Chloe Expenses. It was a document I had maintained for 6 years, ever since she started college. I looked at the rows and columns. It was a sea of outgoing cash. Tuition at a private liberal arts college, $52,000 a year. Rent for the last 3 years, $162,000. A brand new luxury crossover vehicle, $48,000. Health insurance, car insurance, cell phone plan, streaming services, gym memberships, grocery delivery. I had set everything to autopay. I had wanted her to have the start in life I never had. I thought I was buying her security. It turned out I was buying her indifference. I scrolled down to the recent transactions. Last week, I had transferred $6,000 for a venue deposit. I realized now that it was not a deposit. It was the final payment for the catering bill for the event I was too unspecial to attend. I felt a dark laugh bubbling up in my throat. I had literally paid for the steak Brenda was eating in that photo. I had paid for the champagne they toasted with to celebrate their exclusion of me. I opened a new window and logged into my business banking portal. It was time to redefine what special meant. I started with the recurring transfers. The rent was scheduled to go out in 3 days. I clicked the trash can icon. Canceled. The car payment was set for the 15th. Canceled. I went down the list with mechanical precision. Insurance. Canceled. Phone plan. Canceled. I removed her as an authorized user on my corporate American Express card. Then I paused. I saw a pending transaction on the credit card from this morning. It was a charge for $5,000 to a travel agency. Flight tickets to the Maldives. They were going on their honeymoon today. They were flying first class on my dime after spitting in my face. I looked at the time. It was 11 in the morning. If their flight was international, they would be checking in right about now. I picked up the phone and dialed the number on the back of my credit card. I navigated the automated menu until I reached a fraud specialist. I told the representative that my card had been compromised and there was a $5,000 charge for travel that I did not authorize. I told them to cancel the card immediately and flag the transaction. The representative asked if I wanted to rush a replacement card. I said no. I told her to burn the account to the ground. I hung up the phone and turned my attention back to the spreadsheet. There was one more loose end. The apartment lease. I had co-signed for it because Chloe did not have a credit history. That made me legally liable. I pulled up the lease agreement for my digital files. There was a clause for early termination if the primary tenant violated building policies. I remembered Chloe mentioning she had brought a puppy home last month against building rules. She had laughed about hiding it from the landlord. I was not laughing anymore. I drafted an email to the property management company. I informed them that as the guarantor, I was withdrawing my financial backing effective immediately. I also casually mentioned that they might want to inspect Unit 4B for unauthorized pets and damages before the eviction process began. I hit send. I leaned back in my leather chair. The silence in the office was heavy, but it was peaceful. For 22 years, my purpose had been to provide. I had worked 80-hour weeks, missed vacations, and worn holes in my boots so she could have soft hands and a carefree smile. I had taken her in when she was 2 years old, treated her as my own, and never once corrected anyone who called us father and daughter. I had thought that love was an action, something you proved through stability and sacrifice. But Chloe had shown me the truth. To her, I was not a father. I was a resource. I was a utility like electricity or running water. You do not invite the power company to your wedding. You just expect the lights to turn on when you flip the switch. Well, the grid just went down. I checked my phone again. No calls. No texts. She was probably in a limousine right now, heading to O'Hare Airport, sipping champagne and dreaming of white sand beaches. She had no idea that the credit card in her purse was now a useless piece of plastic. She had no idea that her rent check was going to bounce higher than a rubber ball. She had no idea that the man who made her life seamless had just resigned from his position as the silent janitor of her problems. I closed my laptop. I stood up and walked to the window overlooking the construction yard. My crews were out there moving steel and pouring concrete. Honest work. Real work. I watched them for a long time. I felt a strange sensation in my chest. It wasn't pain anymore. It was the feeling of a heavy weight being lifted. The anchor was cut. I was free. Then my phone buzzed on the desk. One short vibration. I walked over and looked at the screen. It was a notification from the bank app. Transaction declined. $5,000 global travel agency. I smiled. It was the first genuine smile I had felt all day. The honeymoon was over before it even began. The vibration of my cell phone against the mahogany surface of my desk was relentless, a constant, angry buzzing that sounded like a trapped hornet fighting against a glass jar. It started exactly 3 minutes after I received the fraud alert notification from the bank, confirming that the credit card I had just reported as compromised had been declined at O'Hare International Airport. I did not look at the screen. I did not reach out to silence it. I simply opened the bottom drawer of my desk, dropped the device inside onto a stack of old invoices, and slid the heavy wooden drawer shut. The muffled buzzing continued, a desperate, rhythmic drumming that provided a strange, chaotic soundtrack to my afternoon, but I refused to acknowledge it. I turned my attention back to the architectural blueprints for the new municipal library project spread out before me. For the first time in 22 years, I forced myself to focus entirely on the structural integrity of a support beam rather than the structural integrity of my daughter's happiness. I spent the next 4 hours reviewing steel requirements, calculating load-bearing capacities, and negotiating schedules with concrete suppliers. My foreman came into my office twice to ask about logistics for the upcoming week, and he commented that I looked more relaxed than I had in years. I told him that I had finally cut some dead weight from the payroll that had been dragging down our efficiency. He laughed, assuming I had fired an incompetent subcontractor or a lazy laborer. He had no idea that the subcontractor I had terminated was my own daughter, and the project I had canceled was her entire lifestyle. At 5 o'clock, when the yard outside fell silent, I finally retrieved my phone from the drawer. The screen was a chaotic list of missed notifications that told a story of escalating panic. There were 23 missed calls from Chloe, 12 missed calls from Ryan, 7 text messages from Brenda. I did not read the texts, but I knew exactly what they said. Brenda only communicated in accusations and demands, likely threatening me with legal action for ruining her daughter's special weekend. I scrolled past her name and tapped on the voicemail tab. There were 9 messages waiting for me. I put the phone on speaker, poured myself 2 fingers of bourbon, and leaned back in my leather chair to listen to the collapse of a fantasy. The first message was from Chloe, recorded at the check-in counter. Her voice was high and tight, pitched in that specific tone of annoyance she reserved for when the world failed to cater to her immediate whims. She explained that the card was being declined and asked if I had forgotten to pay the bill again. She instructed me to call the bank immediately because people were staring at them, and it was embarrassing. There was no concern in her voice, only the irritation of a customer dealing with a faulty service provider. The second message, left 5 minutes later, was different. The annoyance had curdled into genuine panic. She was crying now. She explained that the airline agent had tried the card 3 times and had even attempted to split the payment across Ryan's personal cards. But his credit limit was apparently as shallow as his character. She begged me to pick up the phone. She said this was humiliating and that they were holding up the line. The third message was the one that made me take a slow sip of my drink. It was from Ryan. He was trying to sound authoritative, attempting to project the image of a man in charge, but his voice wavered with underlying fear. He asked me to call him back to sort out this misunderstanding. He said they were going to miss their flight to the Maldives if I did not fix the issue within 10 minutes. He spoke to me like I was a delinquent employee who had failed a simple task, completely unaware that he was speaking to the CEO who had just fired him from the family business. I skipped to the final message, recorded 2 hours later. The background noise of the busy terminal was gone, replaced by the hollow echo of a car interior. They were in a rideshare vehicle, heading back to the city. Chloe was sobbing uncontrollably, her voice raw and broken. She screamed into the phone, asking how I could do this to her on her wedding weekend. She asked if I was dead. She asked why I hated her. She asked what she had done to deserve this. I noted with a cold detachment that she never once asked if I was okay. She never once considered that perhaps I had seen the photos. She never once thought to apologize for the exclusion. Her grief was not for the relationship we had lost. It was for the vacation she was missing. I deleted the messages one by one. I did not save them as evidence. I did not respond to explain myself. I simply blocked Brenda's number, as I had no legal or moral obligation to listen to my ex-wife scream at me. And then I packed up my briefcase. I walked out to my truck, the evening air feeling crisp and clean in my lungs. For the first time in years, my wallet felt heavy in my pocket, no longer being drained by invisible siphons. The next 3 days were a masterclass in silence. I went to work early. I stayed late. I visited job sites I had neglected for months. I went to a tire shop and bought a new set of aggressive all-terrain tires for my truck, the expensive ones I had put off buying because Chloe had needed cosmetic dental veneers the previous winter. I paid for the tires in cash, peeling the $100 bills off a roll with a satisfaction I had not felt since I was a young man. It was a strange sensation, this withdrawal from being a provider. It felt like a phantom limb. I kept reaching for my phone to check on her, to fix things, to smooth over the bumps in her road, only to remember that the road was no longer my territory. On Friday morning, the second domino fell. I was in my home office, drinking black coffee, when an email arrived from the property management company of Chloe's luxury apartment building. Since I was still listed as a guarantor on the file, I received a courtesy copy of the notice they had just taped to her door. The subject line was severe: notice to cure or quit. It outlined two specific violations. First, the rent payment for the current month had been returned by the bank for insufficient funds. Second, a routine building inspection had revealed an unauthorized canine resident in Unit 4B, causing damage to the hardwood floors. The management demanded the immediate payment of the rent, a $500 late fee, a $2,000 pet penalty, and the immediate removal of the animal. If these conditions were not met within 3 days, eviction proceedings would commence. I took a sip of coffee and pictured the scene in that apartment. They had missed their honeymoon. They were stuck in the city, likely hiding from friends on social media to avoid explaining why they were not on a white sand beach in the Indian Ocean. And now, they were waking up to find out they were about to be homeless. Ryan was an entrepreneur, a visionary as he called himself on professional networking sites, running a tech startup that had yet to turn a single dollar a profit. I knew for a fact that his liquidity was non-existent because I had run a background check on him 6 months ago. I had never mentioned it to Chloe because I wanted her to be happy, and I had assumed I would always be there to fill the financial gaps. But the gaps were now canyons, and they had no bridge to cross them. Later that afternoon, my office manager, Sarah, knocked on my door with a confused expression. She told me that a young man was on the line, demanding to speak to Mr. Miller. She said he sounded agitated and refused to give his name, but he claimed it was a family emergency. I told Sarah to take a message. She looked at me, surprised. I was usually the man who took every call, the man who fixed every problem immediately. I repeated my instruction firmly. She nodded and closed the door. 10 minutes later, she returned with a pink slip of paper and placed it on my desk. The message read that Ryan said it was urgent. He claimed they knew I was doing this on purpose and wanted to know if I wanted to destroy my daughter's life over a simple misunderstanding. I picked up a pen and wrote a single sentence on the back of the slip. It was just for special people. I crumpled the paper and tossed it into the recycling bin. I did not tell Sarah to call him back. I realized then that Ryan and Chloe still did not understand the magnitude of the shift. They thought I was throwing a tantrum. They thought this was a temporary punishment, a flick on the wrist for not inviting me. They believed that if they yelled loud enough or guilt tripped me hard enough, the machine would reboot and start dispensing cash again. They did not understand that the machine had been unplugged, dismantled, and hauled away. I decided to leave the office early. I drove to a car dealership on the north side of the city. For 10 years, I had driven a functional, beat-up work truck because I was saving for Chloe's future wedding and a down payment on her first house. I walked into the showroom and pointed at the black heavy-duty pickup truck on the rotating platform. It was the top trim, with a leather interior, a sunroof, and a towing package capable of pulling a house. The sticker price was $95,000. The salesman looked at me, judging my dusty work boots and faded jeans. He asked if I needed financing. I pulled out my checkbook and told him I wanted to drive it off the lot today. I wrote the check without flinching. That money was sitting in the wedding fund savings account I had liquidated the day before. Driving that truck off the lot felt like taking my first breath of pure oxygen after holding it for 22 years. I parked my new truck in my driveway and went inside. I felt a strange urge to look at my business portfolio. I own a holding company that managed several commercial properties across the state. It was a separate entity from my construction firm, a way to build passive income for my eventual retirement. I rarely looked at the individual tenant lists because I paid a management firm to handle the day-to-day operations. I opened the file for the commercial building in the technology district. I scanned the list of tenants on the second floor. My finger stopped halfway down the page. There it was. Nexus Innovations. Ryan Startup. I pulled the lease agreement from the digital archive. It was a 3-year commercial lease, signed when the market was low. I looked at the expiration date and felt my heart skip a beat. The lease was set to expire on the last day of this month. That was in exactly 2 weeks. I read the renewal clause carefully. It stated that the landlord had the sole discretion to offer a renewal or terminate the tenancy, with 30 days notice given prior to the end of the term, or if the term was ending, simply not offer a new one. I picked up my phone and dialed the number for my property manager, a sharp woman named Karen. When she answered, I told her I was looking at the lease for Unit 204. She confirmed she had the renewal paperwork ready to send over to them the following week, noting that they were decent tenants, although they were frequently a few days late with payment. I told her not to send it. I instructed her to draft a notice to vacate instead. Karen hesitated. She warned me that it was very short notice for a business with heavy server equipment, and that moving in 2 weeks would be nearly impossible for them. She said it could crush a small business. I looked out the window at my new truck gleaming in the driveway. I thought about the text message from the wedding. Just for special people. I told Karen that what she described sounded like a logistical problem for the tenant, not a landlord problem for me. I ordered her to have the notice posted on their door by the following morning. The war had officially moved from the personal front to the professional one. Chloe had excluded me from her past, but Ryan was about to find out that I owned the ground beneath his feet. I walked to the kitchen and made myself a sandwich. For the first time in a week, I had an appetite. The silence in the house was no longer empty. It was filled with the anticipation of the next move. I was not just a father anymore. I was a businessman closing a bad deal. The confrontation that I had been expecting for a week finally arrived on a Tuesday morning. Not in the privacy of a living room or the controlled environment of a law office, but in the dusty, gravel-covered expanse of my primary construction yard. I was standing near the perimeter fence, inspecting a delivery of reinforced steel beams, when a silver sedan came screeching through the main gate. It bypassed the authorized personnel-only signs and ignored the waving arms of my site foreman, coming to a halt only a few feet away from where I stood. I recognized the car immediately. It was the vehicle I had purchased for Chloe 3 years ago, the one she was currently driving illegally since I had canceled the insurance policy the previous Friday. I watched as the driver's door flew open. Chloe stepped out, and the image of the perfect bride from the Instagram photos was gone. In her place was a frantic, disheveled young woman wearing sweatpants and a stained university hoodie. She looked tired, her hair pulled back in a messy knot, her face devoid of makeup. Behind her, in the passenger seat, I could see the silhouette of Ryan. He remained in the car, staring straight ahead, cowardice keeping him buckled into his seat while he sent his wife out to fight his battles. She marched across the gravel toward me, her hands balled into fists. I did not move to meet her. I simply handed my clipboard to the foreman and signaled for him to give us a moment. He retreated to the office trailer, but I noticed he kept watching through the window, ready to intervene if things escalated. I stood my ground, crossing my arms over my chest, and waited for the storm to break. Chloe did not waste time with pleasantries. She launched immediately into a tirade that was equal parts confusion and entitlement. She demanded to know why I was ruining her life. She screamed about the embarrassment at the airport, the humiliation of having her credit card cut in half by a stranger at the check-in desk, and the terror of finding an eviction notice taped to her door. She accused me of being petty, vindictive, and cruel. She told me that I was overreacting to a simple misunderstanding about a wedding guest list, claiming that they had kept the ceremony small to save money and reduce stress. She stood there, breathless and red-faced, waiting for me to apologize, to pull out my checkbook, and to fix the mess I had made. I looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time since the wedding. I realized then that she truly believed her own narrative. In her mind, I was the villain for reacting, not the victim of her exclusion. She genuinely thought that saving money was a valid excuse for excluding the man who had paid for the venue. I broke my silence then, keeping my voice low and steady, forcing her to lean in to hear me over the rumble of the idling heavy machinery. I told her that I had seen the photos. I told her that I had read the caption about the day being just for special people. I watched the color drain from her face as the specific phrasing hit her. She tried to stammer a defense, claiming it was just a caption, just a silly thing she wrote in the moment, but I cut her off. I explained that words have meaning and actions have consequences. I told her that if I was not special enough to witness her vows, I was certainly not special enough to subsidize her lifestyle. She tried to pivot then, switching tactics from anger to pity. She started crying, the same tears that had worked on me when she was 6 years old and wanted a pony, or 16 and wanted a later curfew. She told me that they were drowning. She explained that Ryan's business was in trouble because their office lease was being terminated without cause. She ranted about their landlord, describing him as a faceless corporate monster who was kicking a struggling startup out on the street with only 2 weeks' notice. She said they had nowhere to go, that moving the servers would bankrupt them, and that Ryan was on the verge of a breakdown. She begged me to help them, just this once, to co-sign a new loan or give them cash to secure a new commercial space. I listened to her describe the monster landlord, and a cold sense of irony washed over me. She had no idea. She had spent so much time taking my resources for granted that she had never bothered to learn where they came from or how I managed them. She knew I owned a construction company, but she had never asked about my holding companies, my investments, or my diversified assets. She lived in a world where money simply appeared, and the mechanisms behind it were irrelevant, boring details. I reached into the inner pocket of my work jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was a copy of the lease termination notice for Nexus Innovations, the one I had instructed Karen to serve yesterday. I held out to her. She looked at it, confused, her eyes scanning the familiar header of the property management firm. Then her eyes dropped to the bottom of the page, to the signature line for the property owner. I watched the realization hit her in slow motion. She read the name of the holding company, Miller Asset Group, and then looked up at me, her eyes wide with shock. She asked, her voice trembling, if I owned the building. She asked if I was the one kicking Ryan out. I confirmed it with a simple nod. I explained that I was consolidating my assets and that I preferred tenants who paid their rent on time and treated their partners with respect. I told her that Ryan's lease was up, and I had decided not to renew it because I did not do business with people who did not value my contribution. The silence that followed was absolute. The noise of the construction yard seemed to fade away. Chloe took a step back, as if I had physically struck her. She looked toward the car, where Ryan was still sitting, oblivious to the fact that his father-in-law was the architect of his professional demise. She looked back at me, and for the first time, I saw fear in her eyes. Not the panic of a declined credit card, but the deep, primal fear of someone who realizes the safety net is gone and the ground is much harder than it looks. She tried one last desperate appeal. She invoked her mother's name. She told me that Brenda was furious, that she was talking to lawyers, and that I couldn't just abandon them like this after 22 years. She said I had a legal obligation to support her because I had raised her. She threatened me with a lawsuit, parroting words she had likely heard from Brenda earlier that morning. I laughed then. It was a dry, humorless sound. I told her that she was welcome to try. I told her that my lawyers were already expecting Brenda's call and that I had a comprehensive record of every dollar I had ever spent on her, classified as gifts, not obligations. I told her that the bank of Dad was not just closed. It had been demolished. I turned around and walked toward my new truck, the massive black pickup gleaming in the sun. I did not look back. I heard her calling my name, her voice cracking, but I kept walking. I climbed into the driver's seat, started the engine, and pulled out of the yard. As I drove past the gate, I glanced in the rearview mirror. Chloe was standing alone in the gravel, clutching the termination notice, looking smaller than I had ever seen her. Ryan had finally gotten out of the car and was standing next to her, reading the paper. I saw him look up at my truck as I drove away, his face pale. He finally understood. I drove straight to my attorney's office. I knew Brenda well enough to know that the threat of a lawsuit was not an idle one. She was a woman who believed the world owed her a living, and she had passed that belief down to her daughter like a genetic defect. I needed to be ready. I was not just fighting for my money anymore. I was fighting for my dignity. The betrayal had severed the emotional bond, but the coming legal battle would sever the last remaining ties. I was ready to burn the bridge, the foundation, and the ground it stood on. The lawsuit arrived exactly 3 weeks after the confrontation in the construction yard. delivered by a process server who looked apologetic as he handed me the thick manila envelope outside my office. I did not open it immediately. I knew what was inside because Brenda had been threatening this move since the day the credit card was declined at O'Hare. I carried the package into my office, placed it on my desk, and finished my coffee before breaking the seal. The legal complaint was a masterpiece of creative fiction titled Chloe Miller versus Jack Miller. The document cited promissory estoppel, verbal contract of support, and emotional distress. It claimed that by supporting Chloe for 22 years, I had created a binding expectation of lifetime financial maintenance. It argued that my sudden withdrawal of support had caused irreparable harm to her lifestyle, her marriage, and her mental health. It was clearly Brenda's handiwork, translated into legalese by a lawyer who was likely working on a contingency fee because neither Ryan nor Chloe had a dime left to pay a retainer. I called my attorney, Alan, a man I had played golf with for 15 years and whose ruthlessness in the courtroom was matched only by his dry sense of humor. When I met him the next day, he read through the complaint and laughed. He told me that a judge would likely throw it out before lunch, as there is no legal requirement for a parent to support an adult child, let alone pay for their luxury apartment and unemployed husband. However, he warned me that Brenda would try to drag this out in the court of public opinion. She would try to paint me as the abusive, controlling father who used money as a weapon. He suggested we settle for a small amount just to make them go away. I looked Alan in the eye and told him there would be no settlement, not a single cent. I told him we were going to discovery. I told him it was time to open the red file. Alan stopped laughing. He knew about the file. It was a folder I had kept in a fireproof safe in my basement for 18 years. It contained the one secret I had sworn never to reveal, the one truth I had buried deep to protect Chloe from the reality of her own mother. For 2 decades, I had allowed Chloe to believe that Brenda was a free spirit who left because she felt stifled by domestic life. I had allowed Chloe to romanticize her mother's abandonment. I had done this because I believed a child should not grow up thinking her mother was a thief. But Chloe was not a child anymore. She was a married woman who had sued her father. The statute of limitations on my protection had just expired. The deposition was scheduled for a rainy Thursday morning in a neutral conference room downtown. The atmosphere inside the room was sterile and cold, smelling of floor wax and stale coffee. Chloe sat on one side of the long oak table, looking pale and thin. The stress of the eviction and the failing business was etched into the dark circles under her eyes. Ryan sat next to her, looking like a man who was slowly realizing he had boarded a sinking ship. Brenda sat at the head of their side of the table, looking triumphant. She wore a designer suit that I knew she couldn't afford, likely charged to a credit card she had no intention of paying. She looked at me with a smirk, convinced that I would fold, that I would write a check to avoid the embarrassment of a family legal battle. My lawyer began the proceedings by methodically dismantling their claims of financial dependency. He presented the spreadsheet of expenses, the total sum of nearly $1 million invested in Chloe's life over 2 decades. He established that I had provided her with an education, a debt-free start, and every opportunity to be independent. Then, he turned his attention to Brenda. He asked her about her contributions to Chloe's life. Brenda postured, talking about emotional support, guidance, and the special bond of motherhood that money couldn't buy. She spoke about how she had always been there for Chloe in spirit, even when she couldn't be there financially. That was my cue. I slid the heavy file folder across the polished table. It made a loud, rasping sound that silenced the room. I told him to open it. Chloe looked at me, confused, her hand trembling as she reached for the cover. She flipped it open. The first document was a bank statement from 18 years ago. It was a joint savings account established when Chloe was born, labeled Chloe's College Fund. I watched as Chloe's eyes scanned the numbers. I explained to the room, keeping my voice flat and emotionless, that when Chloe was 4 years old, the account had a balance of $42,000. I had worked double shifts for 4 years to build that safety net. Then, I pointed to the transaction line dated 2 days before Brenda left me. A single withdrawal, $42,000. The account balance was 0. Chloe flipped to the next page. It was a copy of the cashier's check, endorsed by Brenda Miller. I detailed how Brenda had taken that money meant for her daughter's future, and used it to fund her journey of self-discovery in California with a yoga instructor named Sven. I explained that when I found out, I had a choice. I could have had Brenda arrested for theft. I could have dragged her through the courts and destroyed her in front of our daughter. But I looked at my 4-year-old girl, who was already crying for her mommy, and I couldn't do it. I couldn't let her know that her mother had chosen a convertible and a beach house over her education. So I had eaten the loss. I had never told a soul. I refilled the account, dollar by dollar, working myself to the bone to replace what Brenda had stolen. I let Chloe believe that I paid for college because I was successful, not because I was fixing her mother's crime. I let her believe Brenda was just a free spirit rather than a felon. I took the role of the boring, working dad, while Brenda got to be the cool, distant friend who sent birthday cards but never checks. The sound in the room was deafening in its absence. Chloe was staring at the check, her face draining of all color. She looked up at Brenda. The look was not one of daughterly affection. It was one of absolute, shattering betrayal. Brenda tried to stammer a defense. She started mumbling about how she was entitled to that money as a wife, how she intended to pay it back, how it was complicated. Her voice was shrill, desperate, stripping away the veneer of the sophisticated matriarch she had played at the wedding. I did not stop there. I directed Chloe to the final document in the folder. It was a timeline I had prepared for my own records. It listed every time Chloe had asked me for money for emergencies in college, car repairs, medical bills, textbooks. Next to each date, I had attached the corresponding social media post from Brenda, showing her on vacations or at parties. I explained that every time Brenda had claimed to be broke and unable to help, she was actually spending the money she had siphoned from various men. I revealed that the hero mom narrative was a lie purchased with my silence. I leaned forward, placing my hands on the table. I spoke directly to Chloe, ignoring the lawyers. I told her that for 22 years, I had protected her from the truth because I wanted her to feel loved by both parents. I told her that I had taken the hits, the insults, and the boring dad labels because a father protects his child. But then she had decided that I wasn't special enough. She had decided that the woman who stole her college fund to buy a tan was the one who deserved the seat of honor. I told her that she wanted to be treated like an adult, and adults deserve to know the truth. Chloe began to cry, but these were not the manipulative tears of the construction yard. These were the gut-wrenching sobs of someone whose entire worldview had just been violently deconstructed. She pushed her chair back and stood up, looking at Brenda with a mixture of horror and disgust. Ryan sat frozen, staring at the financial records, realizing that he had married into a family of liars and thieves, and that the only person with any integrity or assets had just destroyed them both. Brenda tried to reach for Chloe's arm, but Chloe recoiled as if she had been burned. She screamed at her mother, a raw, primal sound that echoed off the sterile walls. She asked where the money went. She asked why I had to pay for everything twice. She asked how Brenda could sit at that wedding table and smile, knowing she had robbed the bride before she could even read. I signaled to my lawyer. We gathered our copies of the documents. I did not stay to watch the fallout. I did not stay to hear Brenda's excuses or Chloe's apologies. The lawsuit was dead in the water. The credibility of the plaintiff's mother was incinerated, and the plaintiff herself was currently hyperventilating in the corner. I walked out of the conference room, leaving the file on the table. The truth was a heavy burden, which was why I had carried it for her for so long. Now I'd set it down. It was hers to carry. The silence that descended upon my life after the deposition was not the empty, echoing silence of loneliness. It was the heavy, settled silence of a foundation finally curing after the concrete has been poured. The lawsuit was withdrawn with prejudice less than 3 hours after I walked out of that conference room. My lawyer told me later that the opposing counsel had essentially packed his briefcase and resigned from the case the moment he saw the bank records proving Brenda's theft. There was no settlement, no negotiation, and no apology. The legal threat simply evaporated, leaving behind only the scorched earth where my family used to be. The fallout for the others was swift and brutal, a cascade of consequences that I watched from a distance, like a man observing a controlled demolition he had ordered but did not need to witness up close. Ryan did not stick around to help Chloe rebuild the wreckage of her reality. The man who had toasted to family who believes in us apparently only believed in family when the rent was paid and the office space was subsidized. He filed for divorce 2 weeks after the deposition. I heard through the grapevine that he cited irreconcilable differences, but the real reason was simple math. Without my backing, Chloe was a liability, not an asset. He liquidated what was left of his startup, broke the lease I had already terminated, and moved back to the East Coast to live with his parents. He abandoned Chloe with the same speed and efficiency with which she had abandoned me. Brenda did exactly what I expected her to do. Faced with the exposure of her crime and the vitriol of a daughter who finally saw her for what she was, she ran. She packed her bags and returned to California, chasing some new spiritual awakening or perhaps just a new target who didn't know her history. She left Chloe alone in the city, proving once and for all that her maternal instinct was entirely dependent on whether there was an audience to applaud it. That left Chloe, my daughter, the girl I had taught to ride a bike, the teenager I had taught to drive, the woman who had erased me. She was evicted from the luxury apartment 7 days after the court date. I did not intervene. I did not send a moving truck. I did not offer her the guest room in my house. I sat in my office and let the natural laws of the adult world take their course. She moved into a small studio apartment in a gritty part of town, the kind of place where the sirens never stop and the heating is temperamental. She got a job as a receptionist at a dental office, earning in a week what she used to spend on a single dinner. For the first few months, I waited for the call. I expected the late-night plea, the tearful apology, the attempt to leverage my guilt. But the phone never rang. Perhaps she was too ashamed, or perhaps, for the first time in her life, she was actually learning the lesson I should have taught her years ago, that you cannot burn a bridge and then expect the person on the other side to send a boat. With the Chloe expenses spreadsheet finally closed and archived, I found myself with a surplus of 2 things: money and time. I looked at the funds I had saved for a house down payment for future grandchildren, for the safety net I was no longer holding. It felt wrong to just let it sit in the bank, accumulating interest like dust. That money was meant to build a future, and I decided it still would. I established the Miller Trade Scholarship. I didn't want to fund liberal arts degrees for kids who looked down on blue-collar work. I wanted to help the builders. I set up a trust to provide full tuition and tool stipends for young men and women entering trade schools: welders, electricians, plumbers, carpenters. I specifically targeted applicants from the foster care system, kids who had aged out with no parents, no safety net, and no one to buy them a venue for a wedding. The first annual dinner for the scholarship recipients was held 6 months after the wedding that never really happened for me. It was not at a trendy farm-to-table restaurant with exposed brick and overpriced mimosas. It was at a local steakhouse in a private room that smelled of roasted meat and hard work. There were no floral arches or professional photographers. There were just 20 young kids, some with calloused hands, some looking nervous in ill-fitting suits, all of them looking at me with a mixture of gratitude and determination that I had starved for as a father. I stood at the head of the table, not to give a toast about how special they were, but to tell them that the world owed them nothing. I told them that the check I was writing was not a gift. It was an investment. I told them I expected a return on that investment in the form of hard work, integrity, and the kind of success that you build with your own 2 hands. As I looked around that table, I saw something I hadn't seen in Chloe's eyes in years: respect. These kids knew the value of $1 because they had never been given one for free. They were my new legacy. They were the family I chose based on shared values rather than shared history. One rainy Tuesday in November, I saw her. I was stopped at a red light in the downtown district, idling in my truck. I looked over at the bus stop. Chloe was standing there, huddled under a cheap umbrella that was struggling against the wind. She was wearing a simple coat, not the designer trench I had bought her the previous Christmas. She looked older, tired. She was holding a plastic travel mug and checking her watch, waiting for the public transit I had always paid for her to avoid. For a moment, the old instinct flared up. The urge to roll down the window, to unlock the doors, to tell her to get in where it was warm. It was a physical ache in my chest, the phantom pain of a severed limb. I could fix her problems in an instant. I could write a check that would clear her debts, move her back into a safe building, and smooth the worry lines from her forehead. But I didn't. I kept my hands on the steering wheel, gripping the leather until my knuckles turned white. If I saved her now, I would be robbing her of the only thing she actually owned, her own struggle. She was finally standing on her own 2 feet. They were tired feet, and they were wet, and they were cold, but they were hers. She was surviving without me. She was figuring out how to budget, how to work, how to live within the reality she had created. To intervene now would be the ultimate act of disrespect. It would be telling her that I didn't believe she could make it on her own. The light turned green. I didn't look away, but I didn't wave either. I pressed the accelerator and moved forward with the flow of traffic. I watched her figure recede in the rearview mirror until she was just a blur of gray against the wet pavement. I didn't feel the anger anymore. I didn't feel the need for revenge. The ledger was balanced. She had wanted a life where she defined who was special, and she had gotten it. She was learning that when you exclude the people who support the foundation, you have to be ready to hold up the roof yourself. I drove toward the construction site of the new vocational school wing my company was building. I had a meeting with the foreman and 3 of my scholarship students who were starting their apprenticeships that morning. I thought about the caption on that Instagram photo one last time. Just for special people. She was right in a way. The life I had provided, the ease, the security, it was a privilege, not a right. It was special. And now, I was sharing that privilege with people who understood that special is something you earn, not something you are. I pulled in the job site, parked my truck, and stepped out into the mud. The air smelled of wet concrete and sawdust. It was the smell of progress. I put on my hard hat and walked toward the crew. I was 55 years old, I was alone, and I had never been more content. The account was closed. The books were balanced. And for the first time in 22 years, I was building something that would actually last.